ask anything. This is really your time and your opportunity to learn and to learn more about this amazing thing that we like to call RHNA, our Regional Housing Needs Assessment.
It's 6:05. Should we get started?
Yes. So good evening, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to our virtual town hall on Alhambra's housing needs. Our consultant, Chris Blakeney, will give us an overview of the Regional Housing Needs Assessment, how that relates to the housing element, and we'll also have an opportunity to discuss possible solutions to the challenges we face in Alhambra. There will be time for questions, and you'll also have an opportunity to type your questions in the Q&A chat so we can get to them later. If you all cannot see the Q&A chat, it is at the bottom of your screen, so you can go ahead and click it there. We're going to have some polls that you all will be able to participate in as well. For those of you that are joining us by phone, please press *9 to raise your hand. And when you're allowed to speak, we'll let you know, and then you'll need to press *6 to unmute. And when we get to our Q&A period, I'll make sure to announce that again. Now let's go ahead and turn it over to Chris.
Well, thank you very much for having me here. This is now our fourth town hall of 5 total. So if there's anything that you've that you observed today, that you missed something and you want to tune in again tomorrow, we'll be back at 6 o'clock tomorrow doing this again for other members of the community. So with that, my name, like the mayor said, I'm Chris Blakeney with Echo Northwest. We are a West Coast-based consulting firm. We do this work up and down the West Coast. And we've been doing it for quite some time, and we're really, really excited to be working with the city of Alhambra on this project. So if you pay attention to city government, which you're here, so you probably do, there's been a lot going on in Alhambra over the last few years, and as it relates to city planning. And it began in 2019 with the city completed its update of its general plan. And right now there are really 3 projects going concurrently. One is a detailed assessment of the East Main corridor as it relates to land use, and then a comprehensive zoning code update project that's applicable citywide. And then the project that I'm working on is the update to the city's housing element of its general plan. So we're going to start off today with a little bit of RHNA 101. If you've heard the term RHNA, you may know what it actually is, or you may have heard some things about what it is. And you're probably here to learn a little bit more about that. So we're going to start with a brief overview of RHNA and how it relates to the city's housing policies. So to start off, RHNA stands for Regional Housing Needs Allocation, and it's a statewide process to determine housing need over 8-year cycles, and different regions of the state are on different timelines. Here in Alhambra, we're in the SCAG region, which the cycle will run from October 2021 to October 2029. So that's the planning period for this cycle. RHNA is also a number. It's a number of units by level of affordability that's allocated to every jurisdiction in the city of California, in the state of California. And it's also a planning target. You may, this is often confused with a requirement to build homes to actually physically construct properties. This is not that. The RHNA is an actual target for zone capacity, not construction. So how does this allocation process work? It begins when the state makes a determination for the cycle of its number of housing units that it thinks needs to be built over the course of that cycle. And it has a process by which it allocates those units down to the metropolitan planning organizations, of which ours is SCAG. So the state determined that it had a 3.5 million unit target statewide and gave 1.34 million of those housing units to SCAG. And then SCAG, in partnership with its representative communities, spend some time developing a methodology and figuring out how they are going to take that number and allocate it across all the cities and jurisdictions within its boundaries. And through that methodology and that process, Alhambra ended up with a number that was 6,825 housing units that it has to plan for RHNA 6, or the 6th cycle of RHNA. So in this table, we're taking a look at a couple of things as it relates to RHNA. We're comparing the RHNA 5 cycle, which ran from 2013 to 21, to the current cycle that we're just getting ready to kick off. And in this table, there's a number of observations that we can point to. The first you can see is this big jump from 1492 to 6,825 units. It's a pretty big jump. It's about 450% increase over the last cycle. We can also see that RHNA is not just a single number. It's not just 6,825 units. It's an allocation by varying levels of income. So in Alhambra, you could see that about 41% of all units need to be allocated on sites that are appropriate to accommodate lower income households. And so we allocated out SCAG allocates it out that way. And so lower income in this sense are households earning 80% of median income or less in the region. It's important to know that Alhambra is not being singled out in this. It's very common. Most jurisdictions across SCAG, in fact, most jurisdictions across the state experience a significant run up in their RHNA target for the cycle. In Alhambra, the 6,800 units represents about 22% increase in the housing stock. That's about par for the course for most of the jurisdictions in the San Gabriel Valley. So it's a region-wide problem and a statewide problem, not a Alhambra condition. So why is the RHNA so high? And I get this question asked at almost every presentation I ever give, and the answer really boils down to underproduction. Statewide, the entire state has experienced chronic underproduction over the last 20 years, and that is a condition that is extended here in the San Gabriel Valley and also in Alhambra. And so when you have underproduction, it leads to price increases, and price increases absent of increases in income means that people have to spend a progressively larger share of their income on housing. And we call these households cost burden households. And so cost burden household is when you spend more than 30% of your income on housing. And when that happens, you don't have resources to allocate to other ways to improve your quality of life. And sadly, in Alhambra right now, 1 in 3 households experience cost burdening. It also leads to overcrowding, where as a result of cost burden and other factors, you see more people crammed into homes to the point where there's more people living in a home than actual rooms in a home. And in Alhambra, 1 in 6 households are currently experiencing this. And both of these rates in Alhambra are slightly higher than regional average. So it's a bit more prevalent of a condition locally than it is at the regional level. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the housing element and what that is and how it relates directly to these questions of RHNA. And so first and foremost, the housing element is a required component of the city's general plan. And if you're not familiar with the general plan, you can really think about it as an instruction manual that guides decisions that the city makes about everything ranging from mobility to health and safety, land use, and in the case of the housing element, housing policy. But unlike other general plan elements, the housing element is, it's required to be updated in an 8-year cycle, as previously mentioned. And it's also the only element where the state of California itself, specifically the Department of Housing and Community Development, commonly referred to as HCD, they have the authority to review and certify it. So the state ultimately determines the compliance of the city's housing element within its local general plan. So discussions around housing in communities often center around this issue of yes, we want housing or no more housing. The housing element isn't that. As we just discussed in the background of RHNA, that's already been determined for us. The city or the state has said this is the amount of units that we need to be thinking about as a part of the housing element process. And so when we think about the housing element itself, it's not an exercise of yes or no. It's really about where housing should go within the city, what type of housing is appropriate for this community, and how the city can go about planning for that to meet its statewide RHNA target. And so there are 4 components of the housing element document and process. The first is an evaluation of housing needs. So there's a good amount of analysis that goes into that. We take a look at what type of housing is needed across income categories, what type of housing is needed for people with disabilities or people with special needs, other factors to get an idea of the types of policies the city should be thinking about to address special circumstances. We also take a look at a constraints analysis. And so what this does is we look at factors both within governmental policy and exogenous to the city, and try to assess how those factors might be prohibiting housing development. So we take a look at things like permitting processes or fee rates to see if there's anything there that is out of whack, if you will, to see to identify if there's something that the city can do to help alleviate those constraints and burdens. We also take a look at on a parcel level basis, a sites analysis. And so we do a site-by-site inventory within the community that cumulatively need to have zone capacity to accommodate the city's RHNA target. And then finally, we do a review of the last cycle, the previous housing policies, to see how effective they were and to make tweaks and adjustments and make recommendations on new housing policies that can meet needs and meet the needs identified and alleviate the constraints identified, and to make any changes to policy to accommodate additional RHNA that can't be accommodated based on existing land use. So I alluded to this previously, but it's always worth just saying again and referencing again. RHNA and the housing element do not pose a mandate for developing projects or developing housing units, but the real intent of this process is that by removing barriers to development and by providing enough adequate sites with appropriate zoning, and by instituting policies and programs and incentives and things that support development, the market should be able to, or could be able to, function correctly to deliver housing where it is needed. And so while it's not required to build homes, the intent behind the whole process is that would naturally happen if you're making a good faith effort to promote pro-housing policies in the community. So one other thing that I hear a lot is like, what if we say no? This is a big number. It would require some changes in our community. It's a very big mandate. What do we do if we decide we don't want to do this? Well, housing policy is a world of carrots and sticks, and there's a penalty for that. The first is that the city would be deemed to have an incomplete general plan. And so you could actually be sued by developers, by advocacy groups, and actually the state itself could bring action against the city for not having a compliant housing element and general plan. It also would make the city ineligible for the carrots. So recognizing that the state has given this additional housing burden, target burden to jurisdictions, there's a lot of resources available, and new, existing resources and the new funding resources to institute programs that help develop housing and other things. And so the city would be ineligible for those programs. And finally, you would trigger what's called a 4-year penalty. So by not having an updated housing element that's been certified and compliant, you have to go through this process in 4 years. And the units that we've identified in this cycle that have not been accommodated because we didn't do what we were supposed to get pushed into the next cycle. So you're effectively kicking the can down the road and making this process even more hard when you have to do this in 4 years instead of 8. So that's where we are today. So yeah.
Thank you, Chris. So I know many of you are probably wondering, how are we going to go about meeting this mandate, right? These are some very large numbers, and this is quite a task ahead of us. And so Chris is going to walk us through some of the options that we have here in the city of Alhambra for us to meet our RHNA goals. And so Chris, I'll let you take it away.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, so we've been digging into this a little bit, and I think that's for an appropriate first step is to frame in some context around the magnitude of this mandate and the issue at hand for the city. And so what I'm displaying here is where we're at with respect to the existing capacity shortfall. And so in a city like Alhambra, redevelopment of existing uses is exceptionally hard to do relative to greenfield development, which is developing vacant land. And it's really hard on communities like Alhambra because you have no vacant land. There's literally zero vacant land. There's maybe I think 40 units we identified of capacity within the city on vacant sites. And so this entire shortfall needs to be met in some way through redevelopment. And so when you have these landlocked communities, we go looking for sites that have underutilization and redevelopment potential. And so when we add up all these different things from projects that are already in the pipeline, sites that were previously identified that haven't been developed that we think still should be considered as potential redevelopment sites, and then potential sites that we've identified under today's market conditions that have a potential for consolidation, for underutilization to be redeveloped or have the capacity to be redeveloped, we still end up with a shortfall of around 3,000 to 4,000 units. And so what this is, the 3,000 to 4,000 number represents policy changes. So these are things that under existing zoning doesn't get you there. So we need to make some sort of recommendation on how the city can find new ways to add capacity. And I'll walk through a few of those. The first is subtle densification. So this is taking a look at changes in low density residential areas. It could be small upzoning in single family areas. It could be through accessory dwelling units. It could be allowing, so for context, accessory dwelling units are already allowed. This would just be a policy that would help further ADU production within the community. The more targeted approach would be to encourage much higher density development in the downtown core or along existing commercial corridors where housing is already allowed. We also can take a look at upzoning in existing high density residential areas. So these would be areas that have already been identified as being suitable for high density, but this would effectively kind of turn the crank up a little bit and add existing capacity or add additional capacity within those areas, so allowing more units on the same amount of space. And then we can also take a look at allowing housing in areas where housing is not currently allowed. The main areas in Alhambra where that is the case is along the East Main Corridor, most of the Garfield corridor, industrial areas to the west, and a significant portion of Valley Boulevard. And as we're looking at these maps, I just would be smart to preface that these aren't decisions that have been made in the community right now. They are just these maps represent topics of conversation to illustrate the spectrum of potential alternatives that you as a community can take a look at and decide what's a most appropriate, or what mix of these is most appropriate to meet this mandate from the state through policy changes. So with that, that's the end of our slideshow, and I will open it up. I think we have a poll we're going to discuss.
Yeah, so thank you, Chris. Sorry, I lost my pieces here. So you all should be able to see this poll. You know, our housing capacity does have to go somewhere. So we want to kind of hear from you where you think it should go. So let us know on the poll. You know, go ahead, take a moment to review some of these questions. We have a couple of people voting. It says 1 out of 33. So I'll give a couple more moments so we can make sure folks are answering these questions.
Yeah, and so generally, while you guys have been answering these questions, I can provide a little bit of context for them as we're going through. So as previously mentioned, you know, we have 6,825 units over the next 8 years. So how should we be going about this? And so the first question is around accessory dwelling units and subtle densification. I generally think of settled densification as kind of a trade-off in the sense that it's associated with less intensive changes. So the magnitude of how things look and feel is much lower, but it impacts a much broader spectrum of the community. So you'd see micro changes in single family areas as opposed to these big spikes or, you know, higher density in the downtown core or along corridors. And so there's a bit of a trade-off there. Another approach to question 2 is taking a look at increasing capacity by allowing more density or changing development standards in existing residential areas. And so what this means, as I said, is allowing more homes on the same amount of space. And so depending on the magnitude of those changes, it could result in a change in the built environment in some of those neighborhoods. And so you might see a couple of homes be converted into a cottage cluster or a low-rise apartments in a medium density area, or you might see much taller buildings or more massing in areas that are existing high density areas. And on this third question, I've already threw out a couple of things of places where housing is not allowed. Again, it says so here, but in the comment box, if you have any thoughts of areas that we should be taking a look at from an additional adding housing to areas where housing is not currently allowed as a solution, please input those in the comment box. If that's if you think that's Valley Boulevard, if you think that's Garfield, if that's East Main. If you think that's a site, if there's a site that you know of or think of and or have familiarity with, we're open to any and all suggestions as we start to dig in and piece this together on how the city can best accommodate this need in a way that best reflects the vision that you've already put together for the community through the general plan process. And so with that, oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say we have about 51% of people that have voted. So if anybody else would like to vote, you know, please do so. I'll give it a couple of more seconds. I want as many folks to participate as possible. Once we're done with this polling, I'm going to hit end polling, and then all of you will be able to see the results and see what those surveyed said that are a part of this group today. Okay, we're at 57%. This is great. All right, I'll give it about 20 more seconds. Unfortunately, I think those that are participating via phone, unfortunately, I don't think you'll be able to participate in the poll, but I'll go ahead and read the results out loud. Great. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and end polling. We have 57% of those participating participated in the poll. So I'll go ahead and share these results. So for those that are listening via phone, the first question, do you believe the city should take a more aggressive approach to marketing accessory dwelling units or ADUs citywide and develop programs to encourage construction of ADUs in single family and other residential zones? So 95% of those who responded to this question said yes, and 5% of those who responded to this question said no. Do you think that the city should explore changes in zoning to add density to existing medium and high density residential areas? 68% of those surveyed said yes, and 32% of those surveyed said no. And then the third question was just for folks to write in the Q&A, and I know we have some questions in the Q&A. So I'll go ahead and close this out now that everyone's had a chance to look at the poll. And a reminder, you know, if you haven't typed your questions into Q&A already, please make sure to do so, but we'll go ahead, or you can also raise your hand if you would like me to call on you so that you can publicly share your question too. That's an option as well. Okay, so we have John T with his hand raised, so I'm going to go ahead and call on him first. So John, you are now able to speak.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
Great. Thank you so much for the clear and thoughtful presentation. I had two questions, one for Mr. Blakeney and one for Mayor Renee Perez. Mr. Blakeney, besides allowing for increased production, what housing preservation policies and protections for tenants who are like living in existing naturally occurring affordable housing have been considered for recommendation to ensure there's no displacement of current working families in Alhambra, potentially as a result of that, increased density and production of housing? And the second question is for the mayor. When you were running for city council, you stated that you'd support a rent stabilization and rent control policy to protect Alhambra tenants from unfair rent increases, unjust evictions, and harassment. Would you support adding a commitment to pass expanded rent control and just cause eviction protections in 2021 to the housing element, which some cities like Oxnard have done? Thanks.
So yes, to your first question, we have not gotten to the point where we've made formal recommendations about policies yet, and so we're still working through that process. The city does have existing policies in place that have been effective at preserving affordable housing within the community. We have gone through and identified potential properties that are at risk of conversion, or assessed whether or not there are properties that have affordable housing that are at risk of conversion. So the short answer is we're not there yet to have any definitive recommendations beyond what's already built into that housing element, but we would obviously welcome all comments as a part of this process from folks in the community on strategies that you think would be appropriate.
Thank you, Chris. So first of all, yes, and John, I'd be really interested in learning more. I think you said it was the city of Oxnard that added this into the housing element, and I might have misheard you, but if you could actually send me that information, that the city of Oxnard, how they included both the rent stabilization ordinance as well as the just cause eviction ordinance into their housing element, I would really appreciate and love to take a look at that. I did bring up a rent stabilization ordinance and a just cause eviction ordinance in our strategic plan meeting. And so that was something that I raised to make it into our strategic plan. And so I know that both our consultant for that as well as the city manager has been working on that. So that's going to be coming back to the agenda sometime next month. But that did make its way in there. And so I just want to let you know that, but I have not heard about including it in the housing element. So I'd love to see an example of that from another city. So just feel free to send that my way, and I'd love to take a look.
Thank you both.
Chris, I think in addition to what you had just said in regard to John's question, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the Housing Rights Act of 2019 and some of the protections that have been included in there. I'm forgetting the bill number, and I apologize. I'm working on a lot of legislation right now, and so it's all kind of alphabet soup in my head. I think it might be SB 330. And I know that there are some policies that were included in there to protect Section 8 housing as well as protecting affordable housing. And so I wondered if you can just talk about that a little bit more, just so that folks can kind of hear about some of the protections that are in that act and how cities can use it to protect low-income residents.
So one of the biggest things that was changed is the process by which development can and cannot be approved, and so we're seeing jurisdictions now have less control over denying projects. The permitting process is being streamlined. And so there's much less latitude that the city has to control development of projects. And so it's very complex. I myself am just kind of trying to digest many of the changes as it relates to the non-development components of the policy.
Okay, well, I'm very familiar with the affordable housing protection component. So, I'll build on that. I think, as Chris just mentioned, the Housing Rights Act of 2019 has a lot of measures in there. I think one of the most familiar ones that residents have probably heard of is the fact that things need to be passed in 5 meetings or less. And so there's these kinds of, policies in there that are essentially trying to ensure that cities are building and are doing so in a timely fashion. But in addition to that, there is also some protections around low-income housing and affordable housing. And so one of the things that it does is require that if a building under construction, they have to tear down a unit that is considered a low-income unit. So therefore, they're paying less than market rate for rent. The person living there is somebody that is low income, then they need to replace that unit. And so that is something that is required under the Housing Rights Act. It is also completely against the law now for them to tear down Section 8 housing. Now, the problem with this is that the enforcement of it is basically as we find out about these situations. If you all remember when I was running for city council, we had discovered a family who essentially was in this situation. And so we were able to use the Housing Rights Act to actually protect their housing and make sure, should a new development be built, that their unit is actually going to be replaced and that they would be offered the same rent that they were being offered before. And so if you all as residents come upon these situations, maybe it's a neighbor, a friend, please do let me know. The whole reason I found out about that situation was because an active resident picked up the phone and called me. And so, please do be very attentive. It's really helpful when you all identify these things. Now, I want to go ahead and transition really quick. I'm going to pull a question from the Q&A, and then I'll transition back to one of the live questions. So we have a question from Lou McCammon, and hold on a second. So it looks as if, okay, so Lou McCammon says, regarding the number of possible ADUs which could count toward Alhambra's Cycle 6 capacity total of 6,825, this would seem to be a tedious number to compute, requiring a close look at every parcel to see what capacity, if any, there is to add one or more ADUs on that parcel. Has this been done, or has this number just been estimated? It seems critical to get this number completed accurately. His second question is, if this has been done, what is this number of potential ADUs for Alhambra?
Yeah, I can answer that question for you, Lou. So there's a number of ways that we could take a look at this through this process, and the state has developed a methodology that we can rely on. It's called the ADU Safe Harbor. And so if the number that we can assume moving forward is a multiple of the permitted units that have occurred since 2017. And so we say over this period of time, there has been this many that have been applied for, have been approved within the city. We take that number, apply it by, times it by 5 and take that forward. And that's a number that will not be challenged by HCD. It's a cut and dry analysis. Now, as we've looked into the city of Alhambra, we're observing a number of things. One, we're seeing an acceleration in applications. And so the period between 2017 and 2019 was one thing, but we've actually in 2020 saw growth in applications, and we're seeing additional ADU interest within the community. We also take a look at the characteristics of the community and the sites, single family homes within Alhambra. And we think that they align themselves very well. The characteristics of actual land in Alhambra are well suited for ADU production. And so these are characteristics like homes that have low lot coverage. So the footprint of the building relative to the size of the lot is relatively small, which has additional space for additional units. A significant, I think it's like over 90% of the single family homes in Alhambra have a detached garage. That's typically a characteristic that's associated with opportunities for ADU production. And so when we take a look at this, we're giving the city kind of a range of possibilities to include for ADUs. The first is the kind of lower end bookend is here's that safe harbor number, but here's a number that we think might be a little bit more realistic given one, the physical characteristics that we're observing in the community, and two, what we hear through this process in terms of things that the city might consider doing to help promote ADU production. So those are things like educating the community, marketing plans. It would be going through this formal process of doing a more rigorous analysis and saying, yes, these are the areas or the neighborhoods of the community that we think have characteristics that lend themselves well to ADU production. There's a number of things that the city can put into place to help facilitate that.
Thank you, Chris. The next person I'm going to call on is going to be Ari Gutierrez Arambiola. Ari, you can now go ahead and unmute.
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, so since we're on the ADU conversation, what I've read is that there was a big article in the LA Times about ADUs. It would have been March 20th edition. And also City of LA and South Pasadena for sure are coming up with kind of like a pre-approved options for design options for ADUs as a way of fast tracking approvals. And so I'm wondering if that is something that could be included in this element. You know, they're coming up with like maybe 5 designs or something like that, and then saying this is, and that way you don't have to go through the entire process for every single application. Also, I know that from my own experience that there's a lot of contractors who are out there trying to make money building ADUs. And so hopefully if the city does want these built, that they would help monitor, you know, the contractors and the pricing and that sort of thing so that people are not taken advantage of. I had somebody who wanted a $20,000 deposit. I'm like, I'm not giving you any money, you know, so it's like, no. So, so anyway, so this is a concern, you know, if you really want, you know, one thing is to identify potential, and the other thing is if you really want to build these and encourage people to do it, then it needs to be facilitated.
Thanks, Ari. Yeah, we're taking a look at a range of potential things to recommend to the city. You're spot on about the pre-approved plans. I'm working on a project with the city of Bakersfield right now to institute an ADU program that is exactly that. So it's effectively pre-approved off-the-shelf ADU plans. Other things are like you mentioned, the streamlined permitting processes, fee reduction programs, amnesty programs. So folks that have built ADUs illegally can get a code check and get them brought up to a legal unit. So there's a number of things that can be done, and we're going to be walking through those with the city to find out what's
right. Also incentives, you know, because you know, what would push someone to share the garage, you know? What would make it worth it for them? And so maybe they don't have the cash to do this, but maybe they could have some sort of a you know, funds that they could apply for, loans, you know, kind of how I've seen the city has like a first-time buyer program, and they pay for part of, it pays for part of the down payment, I believe. So that's what I'm saying is like, maybe there's some creative way of incentivizing property owners to convert their garage or to build an ADU.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point, and incentives are certainly part of it. Fee waivers are another financial mechanism. So instead of having a subsidy that you give in terms of the cash subsidy, there's programs that you typically have to pay a certain fee for impact fees or different things. Those can be reduced or waived for targeted housing types, and that's applicable not just to ADUs but for affordable housing as well. So.
I do know that people are concerned about parking associated with ADUs, because then, you're going to have to accommodate that somehow. So, obviously there's street parking, but then it gets crowded. And so my suggestion is, yeah, maybe there's some street parking, but maybe there's some city lots that get created for parking, designated for ADU parking, for example. And I have no idea where. I'm just suggesting we need to create parking or public transportation, increase public transportation options like the shuttle and other things, so that if you are converting to a living space and adding more population, whether it's a single or a couple or with kids, they're going to need to park, they're going to need to drive, etc. So one thing is to think about the housing element, but what's the impact of all that, and how are we mitigating that impact in this housing plan is my concern and worry.
Sorry.
Thank you, Ari. I think I love some of the ideas you suggested. I think the pre-approved plans sound like a great idea. I know that that's definitely both a concern and a complaint I have heard from residents is kind of the length of time that it will sometimes take them to, get their ADU approved and go through the process. And, the Amnesty program you suggested, Chris, sounds fantastic too, because I certainly know that we have some folks in the city that have illegally built ADUs in the past. I could certainly get them approved so we could add them to the housing stock. Great. All righty, well, thank you, Ari. So we will go ahead. I'm gonna call on the next person. So we have a question from Thomas Wong, and he says, how many units of housing were actually built of the 5th cycle allocation / targets?
Thank you, Thomas. Yeah, so I don't have the actual number as it is today because the city just updated this. It was done, I think, last week. So I can give you a rough number. Is before counting this year's numbers, it was right around 350-ish. But I'd have to go and find that fresh document, which I don't even know if it's been made available yet. I know the city has submitted it to HDD, but I don't have the data at this point.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and call another question. If anybody would like to ask a question live, please raise your hands. And a reminder for those that are on the phone, if you would like to ask a question and you are calling in using a telephone number, please press *9 to raise your hand, and then I will go ahead and call on you and allow you to speak. So remember *9 if you want to ask a live question. So the next question we have is, how can we make sure we meet RHNA goals for extremely low income and low income housing?
Yeah, certainly. So when we start to take a look at the sites inventory component of the housing element, there are certain criteria that we have to meet when we allocate a site for lower income RHNA. And so effectively, we have to ensure that sites have characteristics that are more suitable for affordable housing, because development is hard to get to happen. Affordable housing is really hard to get to happen. And so we need to take a look at sites that that are of a certain size to allow the economies of scale necessary to get enough units to be able to make the project quote pencil. We need to take a look at sites that have an appropriate density for the very same reason. And another important factor that often gets missed when we're talking about affordable housing is the geographic location of affordable housing. And so the state has new mandates on where we can put affordable housing allocations based on opportunity. So we don't want to be in a position where the city is putting all of its affordable housing in a low resource area. It's actually required that we take a look at areas of opportunity within the city and look for places where affordable housing sites meet those criteria, but also are in areas of high opportunity.
Thank you, Chris. We have, this is not a question, but just a statement on behalf of Ebeth Moharo. And so Ebeth Moharo shares, the zoning should not be changed in areas that are not zoned for housing. Thank you, Ebeth, for sharing your thoughts. We have another question from Eric. Eric says, assuming the most optimistic forecast, how many additional units might come to market by simply encouraging more aggressive ADU development? Is it even feasible to meet the RHNA goals by simply encouraging ADU construction?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Eric. It's not likely to be a massive dent. There's some communities like South Pasadena that are considering upwards of 1,000 units to meet their allocation. I don't think we'll get nearly that high. So for context, let's see, I don't think I have the number right in front of me, but there are some 8,000 something single family homes in the city of Alhambra. And a percentage of those we are finding have characteristics that are suitable for ADUs. I would be shocked if the number goes any higher than 10% of the RHNA allocation. So it's going to be under 600 units, I'm sure, just based on existing patterns of ADU production and what we're seeing in the data. So I wouldn't consider it close to coming. The city's not going to solve its housing problem through building 6,000 ADUs. That's not a reasonable expectation. So.
Next up, we have a question from an anonymous attendee. They say, for Chris, in your professional opinion, is it possible to pursue RSO ordinances while also simultaneously encouraging city initiatives that aim to meet the RHNA goals?
So we don't consider things like rent stabilization ordinances in the context of like meeting the city's RHNA, but it is certainly something that the city can look at to help protect existing homeowners. As the mayor already mentioned, there is a state law that now requires that any unit that has a low-income household in it that gets replaced has to be replaced in the new development with an affordable housing unit. Other things that the city has already instituted is, for example, the Inclusionary housing ordinance. So any development over a certain size now must have an affordability component. So as it relates to meeting RHNA, RSOs don't really have a role there, but it is a part of the housing element. It's a part of addressing identified housing need in terms of households of varying levels of income.
Great, thank you. We have another question from Ebeth Kamo Maharo, and she says, how are the neighboring cities, i.e. San Marino, working with compliance of the requirements. And Chris, I want to kind of build on this question. I think, a number of our residents, including myself, have seen, previously when cities like San Marino, some of these other very wealthy cities, be it Beverly Hills, were provided RHNA numbers. They were provided a RHNA number of 1 or 2, laughable numbers. And so, I know many of our residents are aware of this as well, given San Marino is right next to us. And so, for San Marino and other wealthier cities, right, how is this being done more equitably now?
Mm-hmm. San Marino specific came up in our first town hall, actually, a question about San Marino. And I didn't have an answer for their number. And somebody made a comment that why is San Marino's number so much lower than ours? Well, there's actually some truth to that. San Marino's number as a percent, obviously its number is going to be considerably lower because it's a smaller community. So as a percentage of households, or as an absolute number, it is quite low. As a percentage of households, it's low, but not outrageously low. And so the methodology that SCAG used to allocate RHNA to different jurisdictions, the fact of the matter is Alhambra scored high on those criteria and San Marino didn't. And I haven't done a deep dive into San Marino's characteristics, but I know that the two metrics that had the biggest influence over the allocation methodology was access to jobs and also proximity to a percentage of regional jobs and locate a percentage of the population within high quality transit areas. And my guess is that second one is likely the contributing factor, that San Marino's number is slightly lower on a percentage basis than Alhambra's. To the second part of the question of what communities are doing, I mentioned South Pasadena already. They're taking a look at ADUs as a significant component. They're looking at rezoning large commercial sites, which is what a lot of communities actually are doing. So taking a look at large underutilized commercial properties that might have high rates of vacancy in them. They're big box with a sea of parking associated with them. Communities are looking at upzoning strategies. So that's kind of the menu of things. Some jurisdictions are looking at upzoning in single family neighborhoods. So allowing duplexes and fourplexes and stuff in neighborhoods. The state is looking at that. It might SB 9 right now. I'm not up on whether or not that's polling well or not, but it's a rehash of 1120 and a rehash of SB 50. So the state has been very dedicated to trying to alleviate single family zoning. So we might be in that world within a number of years anyway. So.
Great, thank you, Chris. This is not a question here, but more a request for assistance from me. So Angie T says, hi, Mayor. I'm currently renovating my house and I have no bathroom that I can use at the moment. I submitted my permits 3 weeks ago and was just today that I was told that I needed to submit another type of permit. I lost 3 weeks. How can we speed up the process for house renovation permits? Thank you. So Chris, I don't know if you're able to respond to this, but Angie, I'm going to go ahead and respond to your question and just put in the email from my assistant. If you can go ahead and just email her, and then I'll go ahead and follow up to see what's happening so we can move things through and kind of speed up this process.
Yeah, and I don't have any insights into a specific property's permitting process. Yeah. So yeah, that would be the best path for you, Angie.
Great. So next up, I'm going to call on Ari Gutierrez Arambiola again. So Ari, I'm now allowing you to talk. Feel free to unmute yourself.
Yeah, so Chris, I just wanted to take issue with what you said just now, that Alhambra has a housing problem. I don't know that we have a housing problem, do we? Because I know that there's RHNA numbers, but those are not mandatory. And these are goals, and you don't even have to actually build them. You just need to have a plan for the elements. And so I just don't want to scare people into thinking that our city has to import almost 7,000 living units into our city.
Thanks, Ari.
We're coming up on 7 o'clock.
Okay, great. Let's try to I think we can get through a couple more of some of these questions. So the next question that we have is, how can we avoid gentrification for 60% of Alhambrans who've lived here for decades? And is a potential way to avoid gentrification for our renters to build more density?
Yeah, so I mean, we've addressed this a little bit already. So you know, a number of things. First, the path of adding housing in places that don't currently allow housing is not displacing folks. That's adding new capacity. As we discussed previously, when we're talking about redevelopment, it's a unit for unit. In fact, it's more than a unit for unit. I think at a certain scale, I think it's 1.5 units per displaced affordable housing unit. So if we, you know, say you have a building that that has 6 units on it, and it gets redeveloped and they're all affordable units, and a new building with 20 gets put in its place with 20 units, then 10 units of those have to be reserved for households of the income level that we're already living there. And so there's protections that have been in place in that sense. But the broader question is the solution is that the idea around housing production is that it impacts the economics and the supply and demand balance of housing in the community, and it should moderate price increases relative to income, and which is really, when I speak of problems in a community, it's around affordability. And that's something that shows up in the data. And it's also something that's shown up in community surveys that we've done as a part of our workshop process. The issue of affordability is front and center in almost every community in Southern California. And sadly, Alhambra hasn't been spared in that sense. So.
Great, thank you, Chris. I'm going to kind of speed through some of these. So we have just a comment from Shirley Tatsuno. Shirley says, contractors/builders are encouraging apartment owners to build ADUs, for instance, in carports. I couldn't do it because it would take away parking from tenants. They would be very unhappy. Thank you for sharing that, Shirley. Next up, we have a question from an anonymous attendee. Does supportive housing, elderly, and converted motels/hotels count towards RHNA goals? What state funding could be used towards these housing types, or mixed-use county/city run housing?
Yes, and so there's a number of programs. Obviously, if most people might be familiar with Project Room Key and Project Home Key. This was money that was put out by the state for purchase and renovation of defunct hotels and motels, or lower quality hotels and motels to transition to rehabilitate into transitionary housing or supportive housing. Super successful program by all counts, able to produce a significant amount of housing at a lower per door cost than you could do, and quicker than you could do from a redevelopment perspective. Other things that the city is already doing, for example, which they should be commended for, is disposing of city property. So there's 2 projects right now that are being considered in the community that were city-owned pieces of property that are now being considered for permanent 100% affordable housing. And in the case of the Chapel project, I believe it's also for formerly homeless housing. And so under the current proposal. So those are things the city is already doing to try to assist those segments of the population.
Great, thank you, Chris. The next question I have is for me. It's from Eric. It says, hey, Sasha, do you have any thoughts on upzoning and how it might be strategically utilized to help increase the housing stock? So yes, I do. Some of the areas that, I think could be good opportunities for us to look at potentially doing some upzoning is around Valley Boulevard in particular. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Old Town Pasadena. right around Colorado Boulevard. And what you see there is a lot of mixed use, right? So businesses on the bottom, apartments on the top. And I think that could be a good opportunity and could be a setup that we can have along certain parts of Valley. And so that's something I'm really interested in kind of exploring. I think I would really like to bring in new restaurants, really create opportunities for some of our local mom and pop businesses, but also create opportunities too for those that are interested in living and renting here in the city of Alhambra to be able to do so. And so I think there's parts of Valley that we've had vacant businesses for a very long time. The structures need some updating. We also have some really beautiful historic structures that I think that we can kind of update, renovate, preserve, and do some really interesting, cool things. So that's what I'm hoping for, and I'm hoping to explore that more while I'm on the council. The next question that we have is from Lou McCammon. Lou McCammon says, in your organization's prior presentations to the City Council and the Planning Commission at the beginning of your work last fall, your presentations included the number of housing units completed during the current 8-year RHNA Cycle 5, which ends in October 2021. Those presentations, including a breakdown by income level of the housing units produced, those numbers showed that through the end of 2019 in Cycle 5, 0 units had been built in the very low income category. It also showed that only 10 units had been completed in the low income, and those were all completed in 2018 or 2019. Were those 10 units all ADUs completed after the state law changed in 2017?
I can answer part of this question, Lou. So I don't believe that ADU numbers in the city's annual progress report were included in as low income. As part of that, I don't think they have the data to be able to make that allocation. And so my answer would be a tentative no. I don't think ADUs were accounted for the low. I know there were a couple of like really small projects that were affordable projects that were approved and constructed within that time period, and that's what I believe accounts for the 10 units in the low category.
Thank you. We have another comment from Shirley Tatsuno. She says, several people have spoken about preserving existing affordable housing. I wanted to suggest help for especially small landlords, especially 4 units and less, in maintaining their property. Thank you for sharing that, Shirley. I will go ahead and make note of that. Thank you. The next question we have is from an anonymous attendee. They say, how can we protect families renting near those upzoning developments from potentially increased rents? A Berkeley study showed that it takes a long time for new developments to filter down, and SB 330 can't replace housing right away. What can be done in the meantime? So I think I can go ahead and answer this. There's a couple of different things, that we're looking at in the city of Alhambra. Number one, we have our inclusionary housing ordinance. And so we want to make sure that we are encouraging as many, kind of new developments that are coming into the city as possible, that they're really making sure that 15% of whatever units they're building are affordable. And so we want to enforce that, encourage that as much as possible. On top of that, as I mentioned before, we are looking at a rent stabilization ordinance. This is something that I brought up during our strategic plan meeting, as well as a no-fault eviction ordinance. And so, those are both opportunities we'll be exploring. If any of you are kind of familiar with no-fault eviction. So, right now, unfortunately, in the city of Alhambra, you can be evicted due to absolutely no fault of your own. You could be paying your rent on time, doing everything right. I could be evicted, right now, for no reason other than the fact that my landlord wants me to leave. And so, we want to create more protections so that renters have more certainty in those situations. And so, those are some of the things that we're going to be looking at in the months to come. Another thing that I forgot to mention that's also included in our strategic plan is that we're going to be cracking down on slumlords that are in the city. I think this was something that I kind of discovered as I was walking and, campaigning and moving across Alhambra, that unfortunately we do have some of these repeat offenders who continue to violate health and safety codes. And so, we want to make sure that those folks are held accountable. And that they're being fined, that they're being reported to the city and reported to the county, depending on how serious the situation is. So those are some of the things that we're looking at in terms of protections for tenants that live here in the city. And Chris, I don't know if you wanted to add anything in beyond that.
No, you hit it on the head. Those are the things that you should be looking at. IHO is a big one. So yeah, I think you're thinking about it in the correct way.
Great. So that is pretty much it for our presentation today. Chris, I just want to thank you for taking the time to do this and, for, essentially volunteering yourself and your organization to assist us with doing these town halls. As was mentioned earlier, if you want to participate in another town hall, again, Jeff Maloney will be holding his town hall tomorrow at 6 p.m. So please be sure, to tune into that. If you have any questions for me that you weren't able to ask during this town hall, maybe you felt a bit shy, feel free to reach out. My email is available. My assistant's email is available on the city website. You can go ahead and email her. We can sit down and chat. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have as we kind of explore this process further. But please encourage your neighbors, your friends, your family to continue to get involved, share their opinions about this subject. This is a very kind of difficult subject that we're navigating, and we want to hear as much community feedback as possible as we're making these decisions. So thank you all for joining us.